Welcome to the Light Your Heart with Hope podcast. I'm Erin, and I'm so thankful you're here. My hope and prayer are that through listening to today's episode, God will encourage you and do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine. It's hard to comprehend the love of God, especially in a world where love is defined by the world's standards, a love that is far from perfect, a love that is temporary, not eternal, circumstantial and not freely given, based on who you are, not who God says you are. But there is a mighty God whose love surpasses any earthly love. In today's message, Valerie shares how she wrestled with God during the most difficult season of her life, and how through that season, God revealed his amazing love to her. I hope that after listening to Valerie's story, you will know how much God loves you.
Who I am, who I was born to be, is Nick and Abby's mom. You know, that's what has mattered the most to me in my life. And I think that's just who I am. I have a lot of hobbies and a lot of other things matter. I love being a wife, have a great husband. He's been a rock. He's really been a rock. Nick was just like me. Fire all the time. he just was. Everything was funny. Everything was an adventure. God works in such mysterious ways. Nick had a heart defect when he was born. We found it literally the day after he was born. The pediatrician came in and said, he's got a murmur. We're just going to watch it. We're going to send you over. We literally had to leave the hospital and go for an echocardiogram. And cardiologist was like, yeah, he has a murmur. We'll just have to, he has a hole in his heart. We'll just have to see what it does. And long story short, it did not close. He ended up at 5 months old having to have open heart surgery in Nashville. He almost died. He went into ventricular fibrillation on the operating table, and his heart had to be massaged, and it was really so scary. I said, God's ways are just so incomprehensible. And, I see that looking back as such a gift, because we already treasured our kids, but then, like every little thing he did, we just oohed and awed. His whole life, that's all he knew. It was hilarious. But he just thought everything was funny. He and his sister have the same heart in a way that they're both just very selfless. Who I feel like I am is their mom, and I'm so thankful for that. Nick was diagnosed with adrenoleukodystrophy when he was 6. He was in kindergarten at the time. Kindergarten was hard for him from the beginning. So he started in like September when he had just turned 6 in August. And it was hard. He hated it. We just thought he hated it because he had had a very free life, been able to do whatever he wanted. Here he was constricted in this setting. And also, he was a quiet kid, hadn't been around a lot of strangers, and we just thought it was so much. But in the early part of November, the teacher called us in for a meeting, and she said, his handwriting is deteriorated. And she literally had a copy of his handwriting, and it was not as good. So we took him to the pediatrician. Well, he said he definitely did have an ear infection. Let's see if that's just messing up his motor skills. That can happen if you've got having some inner ear issues. So we were on an antibiotic. So we went on an antibiotic, and then we were into Thanksgiving break. And I noticed that Nick, who was a comedian and had bunk beds in his room, and he took his memo in there on Thanksgiving, and I was in there with him, and he would jump off the top of the bunk beds and land, and like do a flip or something. He was a maniac. That's how he had always lived. But when he landed, it was off balance. And he looked at me because he was so perceptive. And I have always been kind of an open book. And he said, "What?" And I just said, nothing, nothing. And so he went on about his business, and we went on, and I was alarmed. Took him to the pediatrician on Monday then after that. And he did some balance tests, and he said, yeah, he's off balance. Let's send him for a CAT scan. We feared the worst was cancer. We didn't know about adrenoleukodystrophy. I had never heard the word, didn't know horrors like this could happen to innocent children. Anyway, the CAT scan was bad. Went to a neurologist. He still, I have his documentation in the book. He said, well, he's had an ear infection. So maybe it's from that. Maybe it's some cerebrolitis from the ear infection. Can't rule out a white matter disease, which I didn't even know what that was in a kid at the time, but we're going to watch him. Well, watching him was horrendous. It was a horrendous thing because literally every day he got worse. Every day we were on the phone with the neurologist. Every day we were saying, something's wrong. Within 3 weeks of that initial appointment, Nick couldn't ambulate anymore independently. I mean, 3 weeks. He lost his balance so bad he could no longer ambulate independently. We did not have a diagnosis. We were still fighting, somebody help us. Took us forever. Finally, I think in about 4 weeks, we got an MRI. The MRI was horrible. It showed all these lesions, all this disease in multiple portions of his brain. I think the neurologist here locally knew what was wrong at that point, but he sent us to a hospital, a big hospital in North Carolina, and Nick had some tests done there. But the big thing was they drew lab work. It got sent to Baltimore, and we were sent home from that 2-night stay in North Carolina without a diagnosis, and literally got a call. This whole process took 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Nick deteriorated every single day. And we did not get a diagnosis for 7 weeks. When we did, we got a call on the phone from the neurologist at that facility in North Carolina who said he has been diagnosed with adrenoleukodystrophy and didn't know what that was. He told a little bit of what it was. And he said, I recommend hospice care. It's a terminal illness, and I recommend hospice care. So we hung up the phone, devastated, of course, also very confused and very lost. You talk about feeling alone. We felt alone. We got on the computer. Our pediatrician, thankfully, has been such a blessing throughout everything, got on the computer. He got in communications with the physician in Baltimore at Kennedy Krieger Institute, the world-renowned physician. He was literally the only one at the time. We found out he had adrenoleukodystrophy in January after he had started having symptoms in November. And through our pediatrician, both of them said that Nick's MRI scores were too high to do the bone marrow transplant, which was the only treatment for adrenoleukodystrophy at that time, that it had been shown that people who had bone marrow transplants who had such advanced disease as Nick did, it just made their disease progress much worse, much quicker because of all the stress of the bone marrow transplant. And it was not the thing to do. Both of them totally didn't recommend it against a bone marrow transplant. So we were left with that. Then what? I mean, you don't handle that. You don't handle that at all. You breathe and you walk and you take care of that child. That became all that we did. Somehow we got, a physical therapist or a home teacher, an occupational therapist, began to try to help us, to help Nick to live. First of all, initially, I don't know, I know there are so many different leukodystrophies, and they all have different horrible symptoms, but Nick had pain. He had horrible pain initially. He had horrible spasticity in his bladder, in his lower extremities. And we got on a medication called baclofen. And Nick spent the rest of his life on baclofen, and really, really it helped tremendously with the pain, with the spasticity. So, there was pain to deal with. Then there was communication to deal with. Every day, Nick lost abilities. We had him talking as long as he could make any sounds that resembled words. We had him talking, trying to communicate. We would spend literal hours in a day just trying to understand what he wanted to say. This was a 6-year-old. We were very honest with him always. I think that's one of the things that God gave us, that gift, because Nick always knew, and Abby too, she was just 12. They always knew that whatever we said was the truth. And it hurt. Hearing the truth was hard for a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old. And I remember how we told Nick, Nick, they say there's no cure, but we want you to know for the rest of your life, we are going to fight and try and look and work and anything we can to find a cure, to find help. That's what we're going to do. We're never going to give up. We're always going to try. I remember that we didn't handle it. I was so mad at God and so mad. And yet, in front of your child, you try to hide that. You don't want their life to be that. You want it to be better. So we did have life. We had a physical therapist that was hilarious, that just came in and brought joy into our life. We had a home teacher that was just straight up a gift from God. She just came into our house and started taking pictures of everything, and she would put them on these boards and laminate them, and Nick could look at them after he could no longer use his hands. He could look at the object of what he wanted or what he wanted to do, and she brought all these switches. I mean, everything was new to us, and she brought toys with switches. It was like all we did was take care of Nick. That is how we handled it, I think. We didn't handle it well. And don't worry if you're out there and you don't think you're handling it well. I can't imagine there's a human being in this world that could handle it well. It is torment and torture and horror. You're not supposed to have to handle it. And how in the world is this innocent child supposed to have to handle this? I mean, it's beyond anything you could ever fathom. So please don't be hard on yourself out there. Whatever that you feel, it is okay. It's really okay. God is big. He is bigger. He is bigger than you. He's bigger than your anger and your frustration and your pain. And he understands. He understands you. That the only thing that I know to say is just try to be real. Try not to bury how you feel. Even if you just have to go out in your backyard and scream. I used to do that. Even if you just have to go in your bathroom and scream. I used to do that. I used to scream at God so much of the time. I was so mad at him because I believed in him. We had always been Christians and tried to raise our children, always raised them in church. We believe in God. And even when I didn't feel God, I have to tell you, I think one of the things that saved me was that even when my heart didn't feel God, my brain still believed in God. I think that's why I was so mad. God, how can you do this to Nick? This innocent 6-year-old boy and these babies. I look around now and it's beyond understanding. You're not expected to understand it. None of us are. We're just human. And if somebody tells you they get it, they don't get it. So handling it, I don't even know if that's the word. You just got to keep going. You just have to keep going. For we were told that Nick would probably not live for a year after his diagnosis, based on how rapidly his symptoms had progressed. But he did. He lived 17 and a half years after he was diagnosed. So nobody knows. So remember that too. These doctors don't know everything. They don't know your child. Only God knows him. The timing for his life and his passing, those are God's times. And that's just what that is. Somebody tell me how he grinned and laughed. Of course, we spent a lot of time trying to make him laugh, but he laughed. He grinned. He smiled. He had these huge eyes. But there somewhere we started slowly to have glimmers of life. And I don't know how it happened or when it happened. I say in the book, the whole thing of the book, the reason it's called I Love Him More is because one night, a year and a half after Nick was diagnosed, a year and a half, I mean, we had been living, we had been laughing, we had been having fun, we'd been going on trips, we'd been living. But I was still so mad. So mad. And a year and a half after Nick was diagnosed, one night I was screaming at God in the bathroom, and I just said, why, God? I just love him so much. Why? I said, I love him so much. And God said to me, I know. I love him more. And hence the name of the book. Took a long time for that to really sink in. But somewhere along the line, I had completely forgotten that. If I had ever known it or thought about it, you know how sometimes you just go through life and you don't really think about certain things. I don't guess I had ever maybe thought that Nick loved, or God loved all of us more. He loved and still does Nick more, and me more, Abby more, you know, all this suffering. Daryl more. Daryl, who's this big old burly rock who was just so broken. God still loved us all more. How can he love Nick more? I didn't have to understand it. I knew it was true. I knew it that night because God told me. He really told me. If you're out there and you think that's just hard to imagine, I would have thought it was hard to imagine too until it happened to me. It was just like this love in my little tiny bathroom. Just this love just enveloped me. And these words, and they just were all I needed. I think they were all the words that were the right words. I love him more. Somehow, I began to realize that it's not about what we think is this perfect life here on earth. What is that? It's not having fun all the time, even though that's what we want. That's what I wanted for Nick. I just wanted to have this fun life, grow up to be a good man and have a fun life. What is that? I look back now and I see that God's plans for Nick were so much bigger. He chose to use Nick in a way that I certainly would have never chose. I don't have to like it. I didn't like it. I still don't like it. If I could have Nick today, here, you know, just having this healthy life and have never known this, in my heart, that's what I think I would want. I don't know if it is, but it wasn't God's plan. I will say that after a lifetime, because that's been, Nick passed in 2018. So, you know, that would have been 20 years ago that all this happened to me or thereabouts. I began to understand some things since that time. I've spent a lot of time digging through my Bible. When that first happened, I hadn't been able to read my Bible. wasn't able to for a year and a half. Just felt like lies. I was like, no, you don't. What, this doesn't feel real. So I guess the only other thing I can say to you is sometimes if you feel horrible, it's okay. It's okay to feel horrible, angry, hopeless even. It's fine. It's normal. It's regular. It's just feel what you feel. But there did come a point where I could read my Bible. And when I started reading my Bible, I started in Job. And I read Job twice. And I say in the book, the first place I found my comfort in Job was from Job's wife. And she was so ugly. And I was so ugly. These were her children that died too in Job's life when their children were all killed. She was mad like me. And she said, curse God and die. She was like, Job, just give up. I've already give up, Job. Just you give up. We'll just give up. We'll just die. It's just what it is. And I was like, well, there I am, God. There I am. That's exactly how I feel. That's how I feel. Let's just, this is awful. So I loved that because I said, my whole life as a Christian, I had thought the reason that Job's wife was put there was so I could sit on my high horse and judge her. Well, that's how you're not supposed to act. Look at her. I bet I'd never act like that. And that's exactly who I felt like. She's exactly who I identified with. When I started reading the Bible, that ugly Job's wife, she was so mad. She was a Christian. She loved God. Look how they lived. Job was a righteous man. I'm sure he had a righteous wife. She didn't handle it too well. The book of Job never tells us what happened to her, but I know that Job had more children, and I think he probably had more children with her. Hopefully she got better too. And I just love, how God responded to Job. There's a lot of answers there, but there's more questions than answered. God said, Job, who are you? You don't get to question me, buddy. You just need to accept. There's also friends there that you're going to relate to when you read Job, because friends sometimes want to figure things out. And if you're dealing with a leukodystrophy, it doesn't really jive with human understanding. I don't think we're probably meant to know. We just have to face it. And our children have to endure it. One time after Nick was diagnosed, we would take turns going to preaching. Or for some reason, I'm not sure, but I was at preaching alone at my church, the preaching service. And we hadn't been going because, it was so awful. This was just right after he was diagnosed. So we were in horrible shape. I couldn't sing the songs. I remember being there and it was like, but anyway, I don't even know why I had gone, but I had. And at the end of the service, sometimes at my church, we have what's called altar prayer. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I've always loved altar prayer. You go literal up to the altar of the church and you bow down at the altar and you pray. If you have specific needs, it's so beautiful. So at the end of church, our pastor said, I think we should have altar prayer for Nick. And I'm sure they had altar prayer for Nick a lot. We hadn't been there. My church family is so loving and has been so precious with Nick. But I was there. I could not go to the altar. I could not go to the altar. And I was leaving. I was just going to leave. And this lady at my church that's like 20 years older than me probably, who I have always loved, she stopped me. Not with words. She stopped me. She put her arms around me. And we sat down on the back bench of the church while while the pastor, and I don't know if other people did or not, prayed out loud for my son and for our family. She never said a word. She just sat there. Somehow she had stopped me and held me, and I was crying. She was crying. She just held me while they prayed. She sat there with her arms around me and held me. And, after that prayer, I just left. I didn't wait for anybody else. I didn't want to see anybody else. I just left. But, she never said words. She never said words. I never forgot that. I never forgot. There weren't words. There were not words. And I remember one time after Nick was diagnosed, I always loved to buy Nick clothes. Well, I loved to buy both my kids' clothes. And I walked through the boys department, and I just lost it because I just thought I wasn't ever going to get to buy Nick clothes again. So when I left the mall, I was in really bad shape, and I went to my pastor's house, and I walked in, and I was a blubbering mess, and he had kids, and I looked at those kids, and of course they were like, "Oh, good grief, what do we do?" And I said, "Where is your mama?" Because I'm really close to my pastor's wife, Becky. They said, "We'll get her. She's over at the church." So they ran out. Here I was, and she came back. And I literally remember just collapsing in her arms. And she just cradled me like a baby. Again, there were no words. I stayed there until I gathered myself together. She held me until she felt like I was ready to stand up on my own, I guess. And I went home. And that also stuck in my mind forever. I do know one thing that helps people is just being there. I know that there have been some of the dearest people in Nick's life have been people that couldn't stand to see him suffer. They could be around when he was fine, when he was, especially some of the men that we love, they were fine as long as Nick could party with them. Like if you could be out doing something fun, but now if Nick was sick, they couldn't come around. And that's okay. There are people like that. But if you are a person who is able to be around suffering, then you just need to be there. You don't need words. You don't need touch even. Sometimes you just need to be there. And that's enough. My mom didn't have words to help. She was in her own torture. This baby, she had raised my son when me and my husband would be at work. She would come to our house. I've got pictures of Nick on her hip, them cooking. She always was a cook. And he would be on her hip and they would be cooking at the stove because, so Nick was her life. My kids, both of them, Abby too, and her other grandkids, she always fed them all. She spoiled them all. She was suffering her own suffering in this, just being there for people. That sometimes is all you can do. And so I want to give you a little glimpse of my Nick in this story, because this is a story of what helped me when I was afraid, and I was afraid a lot. When Nick was first diagnosed with this horror, he, at first he could still stand in the bathroom and use the restroom because he had been an independent boy. And so he wanted to do that as long as he could. There came a point where I knew that was not wise. But against my better judgment, I always would let that happen. And I stood outside the bathroom. I would help him get situated, and I would stand outside. And this particular day, I heard a crash, and I went in, and he had fallen. His thigh was bleeding. He had fallen against the vent down on the wall, the heating vent. And I literally just started crying. It was just so much, like, good grief, so much agony. And I was sitting on the side of the bathtub, and I was cleaning his wound. It was a big wound. And I was crying, and he was not crying. He was not crying. This is a hard one to tell. My face in his hands and said, "Mommy, if I have to be brave, you have to be brave." So that's just a tiny picture of Nick. He was so brave. It's crazy. So when I was afraid, and I literally, I've been afraid a million times probably in my life of Nick, those words would come to me so often. Mommy, if I have to be brave, you have to be brave. I'm like, I didn't know at the time that those words were a gift from God. Years later, after Nick was a grown man, I was like, gosh, that was straight from God. It was a gift straight from God. God speaking through Nick to tell me that if he had to be brave, I had to be brave. And those words, they gave me courage so many times. And there's another verse in the Bible that I have quoted my whole life since all of this with Nick. And I don't much anymore, but I used to quote it all the time. It's 2 Timothy. Yeah, I read 1:7. Said, "For I did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Those are what come from God. We have power through God. We have love, that real love. I'm telling you, it only comes from God. And he has blessed us with a sound mind. He, in moments of fear, when I've not known which choice is the right choice with Nick, and I know if you have children with leukodystrophy of any kind, you have faced that almost every day. You don't know what's the right thing to do, but you just pray, and God will tell you. He will give you the right choice, even if when you make it, you're not sure. He will help you. He gives you that sound mind, and he gives you power. Talk to him. He will help you.
When we are going through our own season of pain, we often start to believe that God doesn't love us, but it's his very love that allows us to go through the pain, because he knows that it will draw us closer to his heart and ultimately love him more. Join us Friday for our Immeasurably More mini message, where my mom and I will talk more about God's love. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that Valerie's story encourages you to share your own story. You matter, your life matters, and your story can make an impact that matters for eternity. Make a difference today for someone who is fighting for their tomorrow.